The rain fell like arrows on the muddy fields of Normandy, each drop carrying the weight of destiny. In the great hall of Rouen, beneath flickering torchlight that casts dancing shadows on stone walls, Harold Godwinson knelt before William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy. The year was 1064, and the moment would echo through eternity like thunder across the English Channel. By the bones of saints and the blood of Christ, Harold's voice trembled as he placed his hands upon the sacred relics. I swear to uphold thy claim to the throne of England when Edward the Confessor draws his final breath. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but shipwreck and capture had left him with little choice. Around him Norman nobles watched with predatory eyes, their hands never far from their swords. William's pale blue eyes never left Harold's face as the oath was sworn. The Duke of Normandy had waited years for this moment, cultivating his claim through whispered promises and careful politics. He believed, with the fervor of a true believer, that God had ordained him to rule England. The crown was his by right promised by his cousin Edward the Confessor, and now sworn to by the most powerful earl in England. But oaths sworn under duress are like chains made of morning mists. They hold only as long as the sun remains hidden. When Harold returned to England, the weight of that sacred vow pressed upon his shoulders like a millstone. He had given his word to a foreign duke, yet his heart belonged to England and its people. The contradiction would tear him apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but duty and desperation. As referenced in scholarly accounts from the English Heritage Foundation, the oath sworn by Harold to William would become one of history's most consequential broken promises. The seeds of betrayal were planted in that Norman hall, watered by ambition and nurtured by the impossible choice between foreign loyalty and native duty. When Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1060, the crown called to him like a siren's song, and Harold answered, knowing full well that his coronation would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by the man who had shown him mercy in Normandy. Yet, what choice did he have? To honor his oath to William would mean subjugating his own people to foreign rule. To break it would mean war. On January 6th, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same sacred ground where Edward the Confessor lay in his fresh tomb. The ceremony was magnificent, filled with pageantry and the blessings of God. Yet Harold's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Across the Channel, William the Bastard would soon learn of what he would forever consider the greatest betrayal in Christendom. The die was cast, the oath broken, and the fields of England would soon run red with the blood of the oathbreaker and the oathkeeper alike. In the great Game of Thrones, honor and survival rarely walked hand in hand, and Harold Godwinson had chosen to save his kingdom at the cost of his sacred word. The reckoning was coming, carried on Norman ships and Norman steel, and nothing would ever be the same. The news reached William like a thunderclap in the quiet of his morning prayers. Brother Gilbert, his hands trembling with either fear or excitement, delivered the message that would ignite the fires of war. "My Lord Duke," the monk whispered, "Harold Godwinson has been crowned King of England. The sacred oath has been broken." William's reaction was not the explosion of rage that his courtiers expected. Instead, a terrible calm settled over his features, like the deathly stillness before a hurricane strikes. He arose from his knees slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows across the chapel floor. "Summon the council," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. "Harold Godwinson has forgotten his oath to God and to me. He shall be The great hall of Rouen became a crucible of war planning. Norman nobles gathered like vultures sensing carrion, their eyes bright with the promise of English lands and English gold. William stood before them, no longer merely a duke but a man transformed by righteous fury. "Harold the Oathbreaker sits upon a throne that belongs to me by right," he declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "By the grace of God and the strength of Norman steel, we shall claim what is ours." The preparations for invasion began with the fury of a man possessed. William sent envoys to the Pope, seeking divine blessing for his cause. The sacred banner of St. Peter would fly above Norman spears, transforming what might have been seen as mere conquest into a holy crusade. Ships were commissioned, soldiers recruited, and the great war machine of Normandy began to turn with inexorable purpose. Across the Channel, Harold faced the crushing weight of kingship. The crown he had claimed sat heavy upon his brow, and the knowledge of William's inevitable response haunted his dreams. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the Norman Duke would accept the fate, that the Channel would prove barrier enough to quell William's ambitions. But deep in his heart, Harold knew better. He had known William the man, had seen the steel in his eyes, and the iron in his will. The summer of 1066 passed in a haze of preparation and dread. Harold gathered his armies, called upon his earls, and prepared the ancient kingdom for war. The Fyrd was summoned, that great levy of free men who owed military service to their king. Along the southern coasts, beacons were built and manned, ready to carry word of Norman ships across the breadth of England faster than any horse could run. But Harold's attention was divided, his forces stretched thin by threats from multiple directions. In the north, his brother Tostig had allied with Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, bringing Viking longships in berserker fury to English shores. The ancient enemies of England had sensed weakness, and like wolves, they circled, waiting for the moment to strike. The irony was not lost on Harold. In breaking his oath to William, he had hoped to preserve England's independence, yet now he faced invasion from two directions. The oath-breaking that was meant to save his kingdom might well destroy it. As he stood upon the cliffs of Dover, watching the horizon for Norman sail, Harold Godwinson wondered if he had made the greatest mistake in English history. The summer storms that kept William's fleet trapped in Norman ports were both blessing and curse. Each day of delay allowed Harold to strengthen his defenses, but it also stretched his resources thinner. The fur could not be kept in the field indefinitely. Harvest time approached and men needed to return to their farms or face starvation in the coming winter. The waiting was agony, made worse by the knowledge that somewhere across the grey waters, William the Bastard was preparing to make good on his promise of retribution. Time was running out, and Harold knew it. The oath he had broken in desperation would soon exact its terrible price, paid in blood and steel upon the fields of his beloved England. The bells of York told a funeral dirge as Harold Godwinson stood over the battlefield of Stamford Bridge, his sword still dripping with the blood of his enemies. September the 25th, 1060. Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, lay cold beneath the autumn sky, his dreams of conquest shattered along with his mighty army. Harold's victory was complete, devastating, and utterly pitiful. His brother Tostig the turncoat, who had guided the Norwegian invasion, had fallen beside his Viking ally, his treachery rewarded with a swift death. The 300 ships that had carried the Nordic host to England were reduced to a mere 24 for the survivors' journey home. Yet even as Harold's men celebrated their triumph, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical. The exhausted king had barely time to tend his wounds when the messenger arrived, his horse lathered with foam and his face pale with terror. "My lord," the rider gasped, falling to his knees before Harold, "the Normans have landed at P. Duke William has crossed the channel with a mighty host. They burn and pillage the southern coast, crying out for vengeance against the oathbreaker." Harold felt the world tilt beneath his feet. After years of waiting, William had chosen his moment with the precision of a master strategist. While Harold fought Vikings in the north, the Norman invasion fleet had slipped across the channel like a dagger in the night. The oath Harold had broken was about to exact its terrible price, and there would be no escape from the reckoning. The march south became a nightmare of forced marches and desperate haste. Harold's army, depleted by the northern campaign and exhausted by victory, struggled to keep pace with their king's urgent need for speed. Men fell by the wayside, their strength spent in the triumph at Stamford Bridge. The irony was bitter as gall. Harold's greatest victory had weakened him for the battle that would define his reign and his life. As they marched, reports reached Harold of William's systematic devastation of the southern shire. The Norman Duke was not merely conquering, he was sending a message written in fire and blood. Every village burned, every field laid waste, every life destroyed was a word in William's terrible letter to the oathbreaker. The message was clear. This was the price of betrayal, and it would be paid in full. William's strategy was as brilliant as it was ruthless. By ravaging Harold's own earldom of Wessex, he was forcing the English king to fight on ground in terms of Norman choosing. Harold could not afford to wait, could not gather his full strength, could not choose the perfect moment for battle. The devastation of his homeland demanded immediate action, even if that action led to destruction. The Norman army that had landed at Pevensey was unlike any force England had seen. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder, but professional soldiers armed with the finest weapons and armor that 11th century Europe could produce. Their cavalry was devastating, their archers deadly, their infantry disciplined and well. They had come not to raid but to conquer, not to steal but to rule. Harold's scouts brought back increasingly grim reports. The Norman camp at Hastings was a marvel of military engineering, defended by earthworks and palisades that would have done credit to Roman legions. William had learned from a lifetime of warfare, and he was taking no chances with a man who had broken his sacred oath. This would be a battle of annihilation, where only one king would leave the field alive. As Harold's weary army approached the fateful ground near Hastings, the king knew that his decision to break his oath had led inevitably to this moment. The weight of kingship, the burden of his people's expectations, the knowledge that England's future hung in the balance, all of it pressed down upon him like the stones of a crushing wall. The oathbreaker would face the oathkeeper, and God would judge between them with sword and spear. The die was cast, the armies were gathering, and the field of glory and ash awaited its harvest of kings and commoners alike. Harold Godwinson had chosen his path when he broke his sacred word, and now he would walk it to its bitter end. The morning of October the 14th, 1060, as if the very heavens mourned for the blood that would soon soak the English earth, Harold Godwinson stood upon Senlac Hill, watching the sun struggle through the autumn mist, and felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a funeral shroud. 7 miles from Hastings, on a ridge that would forever bear the name of battle, two armies prepared to write the final chapter of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman host spread across the valley below like a steel serpent, its scales glinting in the pale morning light. William the Conqueror, for that was how history would remember him, had arranged his forces with the precision of a master tactician. Breton allies held the left flank, Norman knights commanded the center, and Flemish mercenaries anchored the right. Above them all flew the papal banner, that sacred symbol that transformed conquest into crusade and made every Norman sword a weapon of divine will. Harold's army formed a shield wall along the ridge, their round shields overlapping like the scales of some great dragon. The housecarls, those elite warriors who had served Harold's family for generations, stood in the front ranks with their deadly two-handed axes, ready to cleave through Norman mail and Norman bone. Behind them pressed the furred farmers and freemen who had answered their king's call, their faces grim with the knowledge that they stood between their homeland and foreign rule. The battle cry echoed across the valley as William's cavalry charged up the slope, their war horses breathing steam in the cold air. The Norman knights, those proud warriors who had conquered half of Europe, crashed against the English shield wall like waves against a cliff. Steel rang against steel, axes bit deep into shields, and the first of many brave men fell to feed the hungry earth. For hours the battle raged, a brutal grinding match of endurance and will. The English held their ground with the stubborn determination of men fighting for their homes, while the Normans pressed forward with the fierce ambition of conquerors. Harold fought in the front rank, his sword-gram singing its deadly song, inspiring his men by his presence and his courage. This was no king who commanded from safety, but a warrior who shared the dangers of the common soldier. The turning point came not through superior tactics or divine intervention, but through the cruel vagaries of war. A Norman arrow, loosed by some nameless archer in the chaos of battle, found its mark in Harold's eye. The King of England, the oathbreaker who had defied the Duke of Normandy, fell upon the field where his ancestors had ruled for centuries. With his death, the heart went out of the English resistance, and the shield wall began to crumble. William's knights poured through the gaps like water through a broken dam, their swords harvesting the flower of English nobility. The housecarls died where they stood, faithful to their oaths even as their king lay dying. The furred, those brave farmers and craftsmen, broke and fled, carrying with them the news that England had fallen to foreign rule. As the sun set on that terrible day, William the Conqueror stood victorious upon the field of battle, his armor spattered with English blood, his dream of conquest finally realized. The oath that Harold had broken in desperation had been avenged with interest, paid in full with the life of a king and the freedom of a nation. The Norman Duke had become the Norman King, and England would never be the same. The body of Harold Godwinson was found beneath a pile of his faithful his face so disfigured by battle that he could only be identified by secret marks known to his wife. William, despite his victory, showed unexpected mercy to his fallen enemy. The oathbreaker was granted honorable burial, interred near the sea he had loved, while the oath-keeper claimed his promised throne. The Battle of Hastings was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The Anglo-Saxon age had ended in blood and defeat, while the Norman age began with conquest and consolidation. The oaths broken in desperation had brought about the very thing it was meant to prevent, the subjugation of England to foreign rule. The great hall of Westminster fell silent as a tomb when William the Conqueror entered, his spurs ringing against the stone floor like the tolling of funeral bells. Christmas Day 1066 would mark not just the celebration of Christ's birth, but the death of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman Duke, now king by right of conquest, approached the altar where the crown of Edward the Confessor waited, its gold and jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles. The ceremony was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to legitimize conquests through the ancient rituals of English kingship. Yet beneath the pageantry lay the brutal reality of foreign rule. The English nobles who had survived Hastings knelt in submission, their faces masks of carefully controlled hatred. They had seen their king die, their armies shattered, their very way of life swept away by Norman steel and Norman ambition. William's coronation was interrupted by the sounds of violence from the streets outside. His Norman soldiers, nervous and trigger-happy in the midst of a potentially hostile crowd, had mistaken the ceremonial shouts of acclamation for the beginning of a rebellion. Fire and sword ran through the city as the new king was crowned, a grim omen of the iron rule that was to come. The transformation of England began immediately, with the methodical efficiency that had made the Normans masters of half Europe. The great earls who had served Harold were stripped of their lands and titles, their estates granted to Norman knights, who had earned William's favor with their service at Hastings. The English language was banished from the courts of law and government, replaced by Norman French and Latin. Even the very architecture of the land began to change, as Saxon timber halls gave way to Norman stone castles that stood like fists of foreign power thrust into English soil. The Domesday Book, that great survey of England's wealth and resources, became the tool of systematic exploitation. Every hide of land, every cow and pig, every watermill and salt pan was recorded with pitiless accuracy. The Norman administrators who compiled this record were not content with mere conquest. They sought to extract every possible ounce of wealth from their new possession. The oath that Harold had broken to preserve English independence had instead delivered his people into a bondage more complete than any Viking raid could have achieved. Resistance flickered like dying embers across the conquered land. In the fens of East Anglia, Hereward the Wake led a guerrilla campaign against the Norman occupation, his small band of English patriots striking at isolated garrisons before melting back into the marshes. In the north, Edgar the Atheling, the last scion of the old royal house, attempted to rally what remained of English nobility against the foreign usurper. But these were desperate, doomed gestures, the death throes of a conquered nation. William's response to resistance was swift and merciless. The harrying of the north, that terrible campaign of systematic devastation, turned Yorkshire into a wasteland that would take generations to recover. Entire villages were put to the torch, their inhabitants driven into the winter cold to starve or freeze. The Norman king had learned the lesson of efficient brutality, and he applied it with the clinical precision of a surgeon's blade. The great families of Anglo-Saxon England faced a choice that would define their descendants for centuries: submission or extinction. Those who bent the knee might keep some portion of their lands, serving as vassals to Norman lords and intermediaries between conqueror and conquered. Those who resisted were crushed with the implacable weight of Norman power. Their bloodlines ended and their names erased from history. Yet even in victory, William could not escape the consequences of the oath that had begun it all. The knowledge that he had won his crown through the betrayal of his sacred promise would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had demanded justice for Harold's broken oath, but in doing so had broken the deeper covenant between king and people that had been the foundation of English monarchy. The Normans would rule England, but they would never truly be English. The fields of Hastings had been watered with blood, and from that crimson soil grew a New England, neither fully Saxon nor fully Norman, but something altogether different. The oathbreaker was dead, the oathkeeper was king, and the ancient ways were passing into memory like smoke on the wind. The reckoning was complete, but its consequences would echo through the centuries, shaping the destiny of nations yet unborn. 21 years had passed since the oath was broken. 21 years since the fields of Hastings drank deep of royal blood. William the Conqueror lay dying in the Abbey of Saint-Servan, his massive frame reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The man who had claimed England through broken promises now faced his own reckoning, and the weight of his conquest pressed upon his soul like the stones of judgment. The irony was not lost on the dying king. He had spent his life demanding justice for Harold's broken oath, had crossed the Channel with papal blessing and righteous fury, had won his crown through the sword's edge and the horse's charge. Yet now, in his final moments, William wondered if he had not been as much oathbreaker as oath. The promises he had made to his followers, the sacred trust between king and people, the very covenant with God that justified his rule, all had been tested and found wanting in the crucible of power. England had been transformed beyond recognition under Norman rule. The great forests that had once been the hunting grounds of Saxon kings now groaned under the weight of Norman law, their ancient boundaries redrawn to serve the pleasure of foreign lords. The English language, once the tongue of kings and poets, had been relegated to the speech of servants and peasants. Even the very stones of England bore witness to the conquest, as Saxon churches were torn down and rebuilt in the Norman style, their round arches replaced by pointed ones that seemed to strain toward heaven like the prayers of the distant. The chroniclers would write that William's death was attended by omens and portents. The earth shook, they said, and the very sky seemed to bleed as the conqueror drew his final breath. His body, bloated by illness and age, would not fit in the stone sarcophagus that had been prepared for it, a grotesque final insult to the man who had reshaped a kingdom in his own image. Even in death, William the Bastard remained an uncomfortable fit for the land he had conquered. The legacy of the broken oath lived on in the stones of 1,000 castles, in the French words that had infected the English tongue, in the very DNA of a nation that had been forever changed by Norman ambition. The Doomsday Book, that great record of conquest and exploitation, became the foundation of English law and government, its cold efficiency a testament to the thoroughness of Norman rule. What had begun as a personal dispute between two men had become the transformation of an entire civilization. Harold Godwinson the Oathbreaker had been dead for 2 decades, but his ghost haunted the conscience of his conqueror. In William's dreams, the last Anglo-Saxon king still stood upon the ridge at Senlac Hill, his sword in his hand and defiance in his eyes. The Norman victory had been complete, but it had also been Pyrrhic, one at the cost of legitimacy and stained with the blood of betrayal on both sides. The children of conquest grew up in a world where the old certainties had been swept away. Norman lords married English heiresses, creating a new nobility that was neither fully foreign nor fully native. The English language borrowed from Norman French, creating a hybrid tongue that would one day conquer the world. The very concept of kingship was transformed, as the feudal bonds that William had brought from Normandy replaced the ancient ties of kinship and loyalty that had bound Saxon society together. In the monasteries and scriptoriums of England, the chroniclers struggled to make sense of the transformation they had witnessed. Some saw the hand of God in William's victory, divine punishment for Harold's broken oath and the sins of the Anglo-Saxon people. Others whispered of a deeper truth, that the real tragedy of Hastings was not the breaking of one oath, but the shattering of the ancient covenant between ruler and rule that had been the foundation of English civilization. The Battle of Hastings had ended in a single day, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The Norman conquest was not merely a change of dynasty, but a fundamental transformation of English society, law, language, and culture. The oath broken in desperation by Harold Godwinson had unleashed forces that would reshape the very soul of a nation, creating the England that would emerge from the Middle Ages to dominate the world. As William's body was laid to rest in the Abbey of St. Anne in Cannes, the bells of England tolled not just for a dead king, but for a world that was passing away. The age of the Oathbreaker and the Oathkeeper had ended, but the England they had created together through conflict and conquest, through betrayal and retribution, would endure. The fields of glory and ash had yielded their harvest, and from that bitter fruit would grow the tree of English greatness, its roots watered with Norman blood and Saxon tears, its branches reaching toward a future that neither Harold nor William could have imagined. The reckoning was complete, but the story was just beginning.